And we are live. You have 5 minutes to join. We're continuing the story of David and Bathsheba over in 2 Samuel. I think we're in chapter 12. I'll see you there in 5 minutes. So you have 5 minutes to park your car in an excellent park where there are deer. See you soon. Hello. How is Tel Aviv?
Nice and sunny.
Wonderful. And Sandy, how are things for you? You finally were able to come out. That's great.
Yeah, been busy. A lot of, and I'm changing my schedule at work, so Thursdays might not generally be. Well, it depends. They have permission to use them. Usually, I'm out for other things, appointments and whatnot.
Yeah. Cassandra is sick today, so she told me already that she'd be, trolling people in the comments as she is, but she won't be able to join us in the conversation. Joseph, very happy to have you here, though I'm worried that means you're sick again.
No, I'm working from home. I will probably not talk much, but I will try to occasionally interject. I'll try to control myself from talking much. Maybe let's put it that way.
Good luck. You know what section we're in.
I do know what section.
Yeah.
I chose. I'm here because of the section.
Oh, wonderful. Excellent. But that means that you're going to have a harder time staying out of it. I know it. So we're going to continue on. Let me share my screen. We are continuing on with the story of David and Bathsheba. This is where Nathan gets involved. Just a reminder from my perspective, and I don't think this is necessary to understand the text. It just makes it more dramatic. David has a son named Nathan. Okay, so I like to think that this Nathan is the same as David's son. That makes this attack even more personal.
I do too, but I actually don't think the timeline, like ages chronology, works, unfortunately. But I would also like to think that.
Okay.
I will say something before we start. So I'm reading, like I'm following this in one of my favorite commentaries for this book, who's pointed out, and I don't think we've talked about this too much, and it's going to be worth for this chapter, noting that the chapters in this section are all out of order. We had earlier chapters, like chapter 5, that said like the fight with Ammonites was like done already, but here we're still in the war with the Ammonites. So there's some interesting, like, why these chapters are out of order and what is the proper order is going to kind of be important, especially and why they're telling the story in this way. But also, it messes with figuring out who's who. I think, like, the questions of if this is the same to 10.
This has been a huge question repeatedly, specifically in 1st and 2nd Samuel, is that if you're trying to figure out an exact chronology of the book, it does seem a little bit complicated.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. It seems that where's his? Hold on, I'll bring you a comment on this. Let's see if I can find. Well, you can keep going. I'll find it. But okay. Basically chapters 11 and 12 have to come before 5, and I think 8 and 9 also have to come before 6 and 7, like because of the way, or at least the way that they talk about back referencing. But the way that the story has been chosen to be structured is clearly like an upswing and then a down, right? Like there's clearly there was a high point where like everything's good. That's when David like asks to build the temple, and then here we're in the descent. So the chapters have been reordered to tell the story in this way. Something very similar happens with Solomon's story, where you have the first 11 chapters of First Kings, where it's told as a ascent and descent with a very clear kind of narrative structure. But if you actually read it carefully, things that are happening in the second half really are out of order, and some of them had started earlier. But for the sake of the story, I think moral clarity and the spiritual rise and fall, they've reordered the chapters.
Well, we have in the New Testament, we have a reference to something that I think might apply here, where an early church father writing about Mark's gospel says Mark was the secretary of Peter. He wrote an orderly account, but he didn't care about chronology. So you can actually see in Mark that things will be thematically linked. And there's a documentary my wife and I watched on Mr. Rogers that was like this, where it would be like it would be on different themes in Mr. Rogers' life, and it would switch from black and white to right before he died, like all these different clips of just showing what he said, like a collection of stories or sayings that he had related to different topics, as opposed to chronologically this, then this, then this, then this, right? Like, it's actually a problem. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think this is a little different. I agree. I think in the Gospels there is a strong movement to put things together thematically. I think that happens in a couple of the other biblical books, honestly, as well. I think a really good example might be Lamentations for that type of thing, and potentially Ecclesiastes. But here, I don't think it's a thematic organization as much as a narrative organization. Like, how do we tell this story to our ends? And I think that's also like Chronicles tells a different version because of that, right? Because I think both authors have a different thing they're trying to get at, and why they're ordering the story in a given way, and what points they're highlighting are very different.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. Okay, Sandy, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself so that you will be our reader.
Okay. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, "There are two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man, prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." Keep going.
Yeah, give me one more line.
Nathan said to David, "You are the man."
Okay,
Thus
that's great. Great. I just it was, if you ended one line later, it's just like there's so much there. Thoughts before I get into it, Sandy? I'm sure you have some thoughts on this. Ooh.
I've read it so many times. I'm trying to think if I have any thoughts. It just seems so... Sorry, I have to take myself out of reading it and into actually imagining being there and it occurring.
Yoav, sorry, 1 second, Sandy. As you organize your thoughts, Yoav, did you make that yourself? Is that your lamb painting?
I was wondering.
Yeah.
In a sense, I have. I mean, everybody in Israel will recognize this kind of picture.
Oh, really?
There is a famous artist in Israel who only painted sheep, and he painted on sheep, and he painted on statues of sheep. So this is just a picture that I downloaded from the internet.
Okay.
However, it's a bit of plastic. It's not paper, it's plastic. Maybe you can see it has thickness. So this is a two-dimensional picture printed with the three-dimensional picture printed with a three-dimensional printer.
Oh,
so
okay.
I made it in the sense that I have printed it with the printer that I helped building. But
Well, it's a good painting either picture. It's a good picture either way.
yeah,
Actually,
I think the name of the artist is Kadishman. Everybody knows him in Israel.
okay.
Just look
Well,
on the internet, Kadishman, and you see lots and lots of painted sheep.
there's lots of paintings of sheep and on sheep. That's
Yeah.
great. That's great. One of the first things that comes up to me is it's just something that my wife noticed when we were going through this is just like how sweet the relationship between this man and this is not the relationship between a shepherd and like it's like a daughter to him, right? Like he turns it, it's more like how people treat their pets now, right? Like he's so sweet with this little baby that he feeds it from the table, it drinks from the cup, and it would lie in his arms. It's just so kind of sweet, the image of the relationship between a man and his ewe.
I'm gonna have a radical take, but if you had other things, David, I don't want to.
No. Derail. Do it.
So I think he says that man is you, and we of course understand this story as being about what already happened with the sin, but there is something. So he's going to get punished, right? We know that. Like, I'm not going to spoil this for anyone. He's going to get punished for it. That's about to happen. One of those punishments will be what happens to his daughter and son, sons, like Tamar and Amnon and Absalom.
Yeah.
And I think there's this fascinating idea that Tamar. If you remember, Amnon he wants to marry Tamar. And he thinks he'll be denied, but there's a whole question of like, how could he have ever thought that if it's really his sister? And the oral tradition kind of answer to that is it's not, that she was actually born before, and she was an adopted daughter of David's from Ma'acha, and not David's actual biological daughter. If you read it that way, then this entire story can also be about her, right? She is the sheep that is treated as a child and raised with the sons and fed, and that feeding is going to be important because Amnon is going to try to feed Tamar in his seduction of her.
By your hand. I want you to feed them to me from your hand.
Yes, that's exactly, right? It's using all of the same language is going to come up there again. And one could read this, yes, David is, one could read this, like, which of these men is David and who is the story about and how is actually much more complicated, because there is another way to read this where this sheep and the poor man in some sense is David. It's very weird. On top of that, there's another way to read this too, which is that this is also related to Achitophel, who is Bathsheba's grandfather. So there's multiple, like, figuring out exactly who is what in this story is very interesting, and I think it's not. When you say, like, what is he being told that he wasn't told before? In some sense, the story doesn't really match what happened with Bathsheba, and he doesn't immediately realize that it's him, right? He needs the prophet to tell him that it's him because it's just weirdly different enough. At the same time, it actually matches a different part of his life, which might add another layer of ambiguity. And we know that he's going to get, like, there'll be parallel, that punishment is related somehow to the crime, right? And he has 4 punishments that are all related to the crime in different ways, but this one particularly seems to narrate this Tamar Amnon story.
That is fascinating, because I also see this pattern a lot in Torah, but elsewhere in the Bible as well, where you get the children are like extreme versions of their parents. Mm-hmm. Like I think, and so you get with part of that interpretation that you're saying that the kind of the punishment for David is that one of his children is like him, right? Is Amnon doing this horrible thing to Tamar is just him acting like his father.
Yes, and this gets into being punished onto 3 and 4 generations. That the next generations if they copy the sins of their fathers, they can get stuck in these patterns of personality, trauma, habit, whatever you want to call them, that shape them.
Right.
And I mean, we also see this with Cain, I'd say, with his trauma about the garden.
Yeah.
But yeah, we see it all over, honestly.
Well,
Nadav and Avihu, maybe.
Well, and I even think there's an echo in Solomon being the son of Bathsheba. I think also brings into, like, I can't help but think that one of the reasons why he had so many women around is related to how his mother and father got together. It's difficult not to.
At the same time, Solomon is also reacting against it, right? Because we know he only has one named son in all of the Bible. He has all these wives. He has a single son. It seems like, whether he really only had one son or whether we're only told of one son, it seems that he is very concerned about dynastic security after seeing what happened between his brothers and fighting over the throne. He does have two daughters that are mentioned very briefly as being married off into political alliances and sent far away from home. But like, there's really he really tried to avoid a dynastic challenge internally, and then of course faces them externally. But it is very.
I mean, we'll get there, but that's kind of strange that how does he only have that many kids if he has that many wives?
Well, is the question that are these real marriages, right? Or are they really political marriages of alliance?
Right.
And how long are they supposed to last? Are they meant for just the one generation, or is he really trying to build something that will last for a long time? And actually, he is really trying to build something, but it's not so clear that he actually. It's one of the real tensions in Solomon, is how quickly it falls apart, and how grand, his vision is. But
Yosef, you are doing an amazing job not participating today.
I know, it's great, amazing. This is also one example of three where someone has to come to a king and tells them a story in which the king then pronounces a judgment which is really upon themselves. And there's an entire idea here of like, one can't pronounce a judgment on the king because they're king, so one has to get the king to recognize the problem within themselves.
One of those other stories is also with David.
Yes, right.
David,
so one is the woman of Tekoa, is the other one with David, and the other one is with Achav when when he doesn't kill Hadad. And this is technically the only one that has a prophet. The other two are kind of interesting, strange people who tell stories to the kings. Wild people. I don't even call them, but yeah, there's some interesting things happening. And this is a difference between a judge and a king, because the judges were not above the people the way a king is, and the judges could be judged in a way like Solomon was judged, right? In a way that the king can't be, and the king has to judge himself.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting element, that he doesn't just tell him what he did wrong. Actually, we'll get into that in a second, but first I want to do a check-in with, look, Yoav and Sandy always have ideas. So I'm sure, Yoav, you might have a separate conspiracy that you want to share with us right now.
No, I already set my agenda in the front. One thing that Nathan is telling David is telling him the future. But why did not David realize that he has sinned beforehand? And let's think, who is David before this event? He's a warlord, and he has this relationship with the king Saul, and he shows his respect for the king over and over again. And he keeps saying that he's not going to touch the king because the king was chosen by God. This was David's view of who God is. He was thinking like a hierarchy, like in an army. You think, okay, God is the chief of staff, and he appoints a second in command, and from there the chain follows downwards, and it is my duty as a good soldier to respect my superiors, which are the king and God. This was his worldview. It was from top to bottom. You worship God by paying respect to the people above you. And when David started to be king in Jerusalem, he, like all king, he started to act like a judge. And nobody ever, you don't hear too many complaints about his judgment. He probably was a good in his job as a king. And the mirror that Nathan is putting in front of him is telling him, God is just like you. God is judging people, and he does not distinguish between the high and the low. He will give equal judgment to everybody. And this is what David never realized. Until that moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. And there's, what would have been acceptable for a king to do at that time. His understanding of that thing. I also think it's very interesting that it's to get him to understand it's a story of a poor shepherd. That it is a story of a poor shepherd. I think, like, to what extent did David have a relationship like this with his sheep, kind of a thing? To what extent is it connecting to a kind of a thing that would connect to David from his lowliest state as a just a guy looking after sheep?
Yeah, I also there might be another thing, right? Where we know, like, one question that comes up is, like, in the punishment, like, why, which we haven't really got to yet, but, like, why isn't the kingdom taken away from David? And especially if these chapters are out of order, then he doesn't have the promise of the kingdom yet. That we've read it 3 chapters ago. If this is out of order, then this has to actually happen before the promise, because that says that happens after all of his enemies are subdued. So if he doesn't have that promise yet, like, why isn't it taken away like it is from Saul? I think this is, like, a really important question. I think it has to do with what Yoav's kind of getting down. And I think one thing maybe to think about is, like, until this point, we don't really have David messing up or sinning. And, like, this is like a major sin, obviously. But he doesn't seem to have the character defect, like essential sins. Like, for Saul, when Saul messes up, like, he has very clear patterns of how he messes up. And it seems much more like it's very hard for his character.
It's not merely the action.
Right.
Saul's issue is not merely
him.
his action. Deep.
He has deep character issues that he isn't really working on. Let's say maybe it's right. If he really worked on them, they would be solvable, but he doesn't do that work. Whereas David doesn't seem to have that same type of deep issue. He has this, like, one major failure, and it seems redeemable. Also, of course, like, there's the huge difference of, like, how they take responsibility. So both of them,
absolutely,
both of them do admit that they sinned, right? They both, like, that's very clear. But David does it immediately. Doesn't, like, try to come up with excuses. Doesn't like he knows. And maybe he's been in denial because he's been such, like, a good, and somewhat funny because he's been, like, leading a rebellion, but in some ways he's also, like, not messed up. Like, he's really been very careful about, like, being a good person, and now he's, like, he did this thing that's so different, cognitive dissonance maybe, that he didn't want to recognize it in himself, but now he has to he's being confronted, like, he's being forced to confront it, and immediately he knows that, like, he knows he did wrong, and he immediately confesses, and and he also knows, like, that he's going to get punished, and that, like, he doesn't try to get out of the punishment. It's really interesting, right? Like, he has to go through the whole personal atonement, prayer, confession, regret process, whatever, but he also knows that includes, like, the punishment. Like you don't get out of paying, the 4 times the cost. The only thing he gets out of is the death penalty, right? That's the only thing.
That's very interesting though, because he does. Okay, we'll get there in a second, but it seems like he does get out of, like, he does try to get out of some of the punishment. I thought that perhaps that the child would not die, right? Is like
I don't know. I think he still believes in repentance, and that's a very interesting thing, right? Like he very deeply thinks that repentance is more possible, but I don't know that's not making excuses necessarily, right? That's a different way of trying to get out of something. Like Garden of Eden, right? I'm going to blame my wife. I'm going to blame the snake. It's not my fault. Like that's not what he's doing. He didn't say like, oh, Bathsheba was dressed provocatively and bathing on her roof, obviously. And that's not what happened. But like, he's not
which is what Saul's response is. Saul's response about all this stuff is, well, you were late, and what was I supposed?
Saul makes a lot of excuses before he says I messed up. And he has to be pushed to make that his confession, right? Like he makes a lot of excuses, and Samuel says, I'm not having it. And he says, fine, I messed up. Come with me and at least try to help me save face, right? Which is a very different response than David had.
Cassandra in the comments noticing things too. The man in the story repays 4 lambs. He doesn't get the death penalty.
Ooh, so this is really interesting because David wants to give him the death penalty. Technically, that is not the law. The law is for theft. That is a very important part of Jewish law. You do not get the death penalty for property crimes because property and people are very different. And that's different than other parts of the ancient Near East. However, kings often in ancient Israel would overrule that and would give death to people who stole, which was not following the law technically. And David wants to give him the death penalty, even though that's not what is actually due to him under justice. And the death penalty that David gets out of is the one that he basically proclaimed on himself, as opposed to one that's prescribed by God.
That's good. Sandy, you have not shared your opinion, so please feel free.
I know, but one thing I was going to ask about, Yosef's talked about, because I was going to say it seems like he could have told the whole story without giving reference to the lamb as being like a daughter to the owner. So that seems kind of a little bit not incongruous to the hey, so-and-so has a lamb. But he makes it more than a lamb. And Yosef has spoken quite a lot to it. So I'm quite happy with that.
Oh, that's good.
Was there anything else? Maybe just in what you were discussing there, in the sense that like this is not the first wife that David has taken, but the other one was sorry, and I've totally forgotten the name, when he's running from Saul.
You're talking about Abigail.
Yeah, Abigail and
Michelle, Abigail. There's 2 other women we know he's married to at this time as well.
Right, but Abigail was a married woman who, after her husband dies, goes to him, and Michal was also a married woman, married to David and married to another guy, and he takes her from her other husband. Right?
So you're saying he has a type? Okay.
He's sort of, yes, unavailable women. But Sandy, I want to add to that something, right? Which is that how do you put this? He does have this type, but I think there's something being said here about like that you had everything. Like you could have just stopped. Like you were the rich man who has all the sheep, has the flocks, you have the women. Like it's all worked out, even though maybe some of it was slightly sketchy, but like it really all has worked out. Yeah. Like why did you have to go and do that one extra thing? Like you were rich. Like you were going to get to, not build the temple, and especially this is out of order, but like everything's kind of going well. You're the king ruling with justice and righteousness. We had the high point, right? This is just the narrative structure. Like 2 chapters ago, you peaked. You're there. You didn't have to start going down this other path and ruining everything.
There's that's in Augustine's Confessions, he writes about this story that he's trying to illustrate his own relationship with God. And he tells this story about him and his friends when he was like a teenager stealing some pears. And he says the pears weren't ripe. They weren't even good. In fact, we just like kind of threw them at each other and threw them at stuff. We took them just for the sake of taking them. And he uses this illustration to show how much repentance he needed, like how much he was in need of repentance. The wickedness of his heart is illustrated in the fact that he stole food not because he was hungry and not because the food was delicious. There's no physical thing that it's even satisfying.
There's also a word clue here in the Hebrew that's interesting. We have this word that's used in two very different ways in the story. This word chamal, and it's used the first time to say that the rich man like wanted to save his wealth and not use it, like be miserly, and it's used the second time to say that he didn't have mercy or kindness on the poor man, essentially. Right. So there's these like two different versions of chamal, right? But they both mean to save, right? To save my stuff versus to, like save someone else. This word is not super common, but it's only going to be this root only really appears two other times in Samuel, and the other time it appeared that was super important as it appears multiple times when Saul spares Agag, the king of the Amalekites. That's the last time it's appeared, and the only time it appeared in all Samuel 1, in fact. As far as when I looked it up. So like there's also a hint here of the other time the last king really messed up in the story that is kind of being like, there's a little, what do we call it, Easter egg, maybe? I don't know what you're going to call it. And then the only other time the story is going to appear is actually when they spare Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, later. So it's specifically linked to the kings and making these kind of perilous decisions. I don't know.
Well, okay. I think.
But then is the word really, that they saved something like in the same sense we would use that word?
No, it's not. It's chamal it's an emotion. It's like to have. How would I put it? Yeah, but it's kind of, you're right. It's like used for in the overkindness in the saving of Agag, the king of the Amalekites, when they shouldn't have. And here it's used.
It's pulling heartstrings. We use the expression "pulling heartstrings" when someone is very deeply emotionally. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's weird here because it has a second meaning, right? Where the rich man doesn't want to, he feels like he doesn't want to spend his own wealth or give his own sheep, so he's bechamol on his own property. So it's not really, the saving part kind of makes it sound much more action verb like, where it's here, it's much more the emotional component of like how you relate to the thing.
Okay, weird question. Were we talking about, I can't even say were we talking about this because it's what I'm thinking. So I was on the stream with Gavin earlier and talking about pattern. They were talking, no, I wasn't on stream. I was on the comments where he was talking, they were discussing judgment, ways we make judgment, trust and faith, the very differences between. But there was a point either in this conversation now or that conversation where I was thinking something's the inverse of something else, because and the word's not compassion either, but whatever the conversation was, it put me in mind of how much, instead of looking, their conversation was a bit about leadership, but instead of judging things based on sort of the top of the hierarchy, now we give way to the things at the bottom. And so when you're mentioning this word, I'm thinking, I feel like it probably relates to things in modern usage, like modern day, but I don't know what the word is either. That place where how you, and it isn't just prioritize things, it's completely the emotion that we put towards things like that. Yeah, I don't know what that is. Sorry. But
Yeah.
that brings that
Well,
to mind, is how we gauge
I
things.
want to, yeah, I
How we
want to
value.
also bring in a different, like a slightly different idea, as well. Why Nathan brings this up, which Joseph was kind of talking about before as well, where like how much can you judge a king, but there's also this concept that so my wife was a drama teacher for a period of time, and she took drama therapy classes as well. And in like artistic therapies, they'll talk about artistic distance, and the idea that if you really want to cut someone to the heart, you can actually have them open themselves up by making a story seem harmless, not engaging with it themselves. Like, it's not personal. So they're just looking at like they get to see it from a completely different perspective. Because I think that's slightly related as well to what Yoav was saying. Like, to what extent was anything revealed to David? What didn't he know in that? And one of the things that he didn't know was actually how to evaluate the characters in the story, right? So there's a musical. You can watch the whole thing online. It's comedic. It's called Twisted, and it's the story of Aladdin, like the Disney's Aladdin, from the perspective of Jafar. Whereas Jafar is this wise vizier who thinks he has a plan to fix everything wrong with Agrabah, and now the princess is going to be swindled by some thief, and she's going to be tricked into marrying him, and then he's going to become king, and so Jafar has to rescue the kingdom. Is the image that this musical has, where if you go beat for beat what happens, everything that happens in this musical is the same as Aladdin, but you're seeing it from the quote unquote villain's perspective, makes you realize to what extent are heroic characters doing awful things, right? Which is, it's David, through engaging in this narrative, in this story, is able to see himself in a light that he wasn't able to see himself before, right? That's dramatic distance.
Okay, this is, I don't know, this is a little sort of off to the side again, but you just captured what I was processing when I was thinking about the other example that I gave, in a sense, because that inverse thing is like, so like today we've got an election here, and I've been looking at
Right.
all kinds of comments on, choices of leadership and stuff, and who did what to who and why and all those sort of things. And one of the things that I was reflecting on from this morning was somebody had shared a long list of actions, which may or may not have been promises kept or promises broken or unimplied things that they just wanted done. And one of the responses was, yeah, so-and-so, this or that person had cut so many things to save money that it ended up costing us twice as much in the end, and so that's kind of going through my mind as I'm listening to this, because everything isn't a unidirectional action. It's always a little bit both directions, and we just can't always see it. And I keep thinking, so like somebody like political leaders, or especially somebody like David, who's God's king that he's put in place, I want to go, but shouldn't he see? Shouldn't he already know? So like when I saw Yoav's question earlier, that kind of was like, what doesn't he know? Why doesn't he know what he doesn't know? What has Nathan
Well,
told him that he know? Like, I mean, shouldn't he know he's the king?
So
But that's not.
This character of Esau is, to me, very fascinating, because when you're seeing the Esau story, if you're just evaluating the narrative, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, you can have a lot of sympathy for Esau. As Esau is this person who's betrayed, who's crying out, "Father, is there not a blessing for me as well?" And all this other stuff. And like, he's starving to death, and his brother swindles him in order to get this thing. But the text jumps in to make sure that you don't just see what happens, but have the correct interpretation. And that it's a short little phrase. Thus Esau despised his birthright. That little tiny thing is letting you know, however you're interpreting this, then this, then this, then this, there's a perspective that it's giving you how to evaluate that story.
Sort of. So I'm going to push back a little bit there.
Okay.
It does add that comment. One, you're using a very specific translation when you choose to translate it as despise. It's not the only way to read the word. So that already is limiting you more than necessary, and your choice of translation here matters. Two, but it's not a bad translation, and it is a common one. I'm not going to there are worse places where there's more ambiguity. So I'm not going to hold too much to that. But the other place is that there's also an entire, I'd say, the whole oral tradition around this, which notices that the only other time when you have the description of when Esau cries out after being cheated the second time, this deep and bitter cry, or great and bitter cry, the only other time that comes up is at in the book of Esther. And there's another author, right? So yes, the author of Genesis is adding something, but the author of Esther seems to be saying, hey, there's a connection here that at least the way the oral tradition reads it, or understands what the author might be trying to say, is, that time when Jacob hurt Esau, and even though God wanted him to, it still like made some, what do we want to call it, bad karma in the world almost, right? And we're going to eventually have to confront that ourselves, and in some ways that happens through the hands of Esau's descendant, because Amalek comes from Esau, and Haman comes from Amalek, and Haman causes the Jews to have this great and bitter cry when he, decrees that they're going to be destroyed. So there is this kind of, yes, there's multiple authors who are all playing at the same time in the sandbox, maybe in very different eras, hundreds or thousands of years apart, but we have to. They're all interconnecting, right? And they're all commenting on each other.
And there's an importance of Edom's role in Scripture is very important, and even that they deserve an inheritance, right?
And their role changes. I mean, because
sacred,
right? But their role also changes. There's a very once they help the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem, there's a very different perspective on Edom in the later prophets than we had earlier. And like they're never like exactly friends, but there is some reconciliation that happens in Genesis that essentially falls apart by the late prophetic period. Then you get to Malachi, right? And Malachi is going to frame this his own way, that battle between you hated Esau and loved Jacob.
The important, what I was trying to say though before, which I accept all your criticism, what I'm saying, and if we had more time on that, I would love to have more conversations about that symbolism as well. But the part of what is happening with this notion of dramatic distance that I was talking about before is exactly how we use the text. Is sometimes reading the text is so convicting, and it's like, what, did you not already know that you were doing these things that you were doing? But to see them portrayed through character can sometimes cut you to the heart in a way that the historical details of your life may not actually strike you. You weigh it as a narrative, and then that's how it strikes you.
And that is very important. I do think, there's definitely that. I agree. The dramatic distance, theatricalness is definitely going on here.
Yeah. Okay, Sandy, shall you read for us? Go again from "You are the man." Nathan said to David, "You are the man."
Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I appointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. And I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife."
Okay,
Thus,
pause. Excellent little section. This, I just want to add this one little caveat in explanation. It is against Torah to marry a woman and her mother. So David, a lot of people have made mention of this. Taking Saul's wives was part of the tradition of one king taking over, because by taking the wives, you made a display of the former king being usurped. So a lot of people would say that David doesn't actually sleep with these women or make them his own wives. And what God is actually approving of is David fully taking over Saul's kingdom. And at this point, this includes the taking of the wives.
So there's a lot to be said here, because we don't know if he took all the wives, and we don't even know which wives, because it never talks about this again. There is also a question on how many he takes. The suggestion I've seen is actually only that he takes one, and one in particular, the one that we care about for the narrative of this story, is that he takes Ritzpah as his wife. If Jason is still listening, he'll be very interested in this. I know he loves Ritzpah. Right, so that is not the mother of Michal. One, that's important. It is the mother of is it Jonathan's wife? But it's the one that we just had, right? The general, Saul's general, Avner, right? This is the one that he wants to marry, and the one that Saul's son gets all upset about and causes the whole rift and David getting the United Kingdom. So if that's the wife he takes, which is the one who's kind of, I'd say, in play in some sense, because someone else is trying to take her at the same time. And it's also going to be super important because she's later going to be the one who comes to David with a special request about burying them and not leaving them hanging for like a year or whatever. The bodies of right. So it's interesting if it is Ritzpah or not, I think is specifically very important, but there's no real suggestion that he takes Michal's mother, and that's the only daughter that he's married to, right? So I don't know that it's a huge problem in some sense, what you're pointing out.
Okay. I don't know what else I want to say about this section. It's a very good.
I would just add, this starts listing out his different sins, and each of them is going to be part of the fourfold punishment. So you have striking down Uriah.
Yeah.
Right. So you've striking down Uriah is basically the answer to that, right? So because you struck down Uriah, the sword shall not depart from your house. Because you took his wife to be your wife, then you have the taking of his daughter, right? And because this gets repeated again. There's another thing where he does part of it in secret, so it's going to be in public, the shaming, and then there's the fourth part. Right. So the sight of this, right? You shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun, because you did this in secret and out of your So they're all kind of here. So there's 4 parts to the sin, and just like he said, there will be fourfold punishment. He's going to have to answer for each part of the sin.
Yosef, can you see this comment?
Yes, I can see that comment.
No, the stuff you're saying is gold. It's quite gold. Yeah, we can.
Love you too.
Yeah, that's an interesting element as well. Oh, yeah. There's a the publicly shaming of David is an interesting aspect of it. I'm wondering as well, to do what is evil in his sight, that expression being used repeatedly in Judges. The first half of Judges is that things are wicked in the sight of Hashem. It's like things have degraded to a previous state. Like we've become cavemen again. Okay. Does anyone have anything else they want to share? Okay, Sandy, where were we? Let's go from 11. If you want to unmute yourself.
Thus says the Lord. You shifted it. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this before all Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house.
Okay, there's another element which I don't think Yosef mentioned. There is a part of this which is fulfilled in the defiling of Tamar, but there's another bit which is there's another bit which is related to Absalom. Absalom takes David's like David has to go on the run for a bit, and I think it's his concubines are staying in the house, and they are defiled by Absalom. And
specifically because Absalom is told by Achitophel, Bathsheba's grandfather, to do so. So there's also this personal vengeance against what you did to my granddaughter type thing probably going on there.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Cal wants to know, Yosef, so why is the son getting punished for the father's sin?
Well, the sons are doing their own sins. Let's be clear. It's not that God is making the sons sin.
What about the stillborn baby?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't have a good answer for you.
I mean, yeah, I don't have a good answer either without being overly Christian.
Mm-hmm. That's a very big discussion.
Don is saying, I was so disturbed by this episode and then not surprised by all that David had to suffer. There was a line in Unforgiven where Eastwood said that the man who killed another man not only takes away everything he has, but everything he ever would have had. Yeah, there's a tragedy that David lives under.
Yeah, not just it's even more than Eastwood, right? You kill all possible descendants. You know, like this is part of the idea of if you kill a man, you know, like the rabbinic phrase, killing someone is like destroying the world, is because you destroy, like, you know, potentially thousands, millions of people.
It's such a good phrase that I would like that many people have created copyright infringement on that.
Mm-hmm.
There was some plagiarism famously which occurred. Yeah. Oh, that's a very interesting idea.
Sorry. Busy sitting here thinking like a girl. I only know of a few people who had stillborn babies. It was horrendous. And also just even talking about the stolen, the copyright thing, I'm like, but it's a horrendous grief. Like anything that we do or we do not do changes the entire world. Like every decision that you make means decisions that you unmake, because they were potential decisions too. Which probably sounds stupid, but
it does not. It's good.
It's the combinatorial explosion of possibility that we have to face. But also, it strikes me, I never thought about this before, and I'm not going to develop it. I'm going to do this very short, so Jacob doesn't yell at me again. When Solomon is confronted with the judgment of the women, which it's about a child who's died in bed and the child who's alive, and I wonder, like, he knows this story, right, about his brother dying, and the sin of his father and all this stuff, and I wonder if there isn't some interplay between these two stories at some level, or at least an emotional interplay for him about, like, he knows what it's like. He has an idea of what it must have been like from his parents to lose a child, and then he sees how these women react or don't react to the potential loss of a child. There's some very weird stuff probably to unpack there. I've never thought about it before. This occurred to me.
That's because you're not a woman.
Okay.
Yeah, go on. You.
Speaking about the feelings of a woman, David is going to grieve a lot about his lost newborn son. Who else is grieving a lot about that son that we are not told about? And why would she be punished? What? She didn't kill Uriah. She had nothing to do with it, because, if the king orders you to his bed, then you go to his bed. Unless you heard anything I said in the last chapter.
I was just going to say, I think you're leaning on what you were previously saying, right? Which is, to what extent which is why I asked both you and Yosef the question, how sexy is she washing?
You don't get your son killed for washing sexily. It's politics.
Yes. The political. Yeah. Okay, Sandy, I want to finish this chapter. So we're going to go back to the text. Sandy, if you'll read for us.
And the Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and he became sick. David therefore sought God on behalf of the child, and David fasted, and went in and lay all night on the ground. And the elders of his house stood beside him to rise him from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. On the 7th day the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, "Behold, while the child was yet alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we say to him, the child is dead? He may do himself some harm." But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David understood that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" They said, "He is dead." Then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes. And he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house. And when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate.
Okay, let's pause 1 second, because Cal has just asked a very important question. Interesting, why not just give birth to a stillborn? Why let the child live for 7 days and then die? What happens on the 8th day for the boy, Sandy?
Bris.
That's
He
right.
gets circumcised.
Yeah, circumcision. So there's something to that. Sometimes the seventh day is even symbolically lined up with a kind of death, right? Because it's a day where things like it's lying fallow, not being used, going sometimes going to seed, right? Like the 6 years that you use a field, and then the seventh year is this year of rest. Rest is like even the expression "rest in peace."
No,
Rest.
rest is really
You
not
don't
like that
agree?
in the Bible. I'm gonna just this is a Pajoian thing, or I've heard it from him too. Maybe you have it from other places, but this is really not biblical. No, not sorry, not from a Jewish perspective. It's life. It's not death. It's the opposite.
The closest thing in this passage to rest would be when David gets up, washes himself, goes to the temple to worship, and goes home and eats, in my estimation.
There's a lot of things here. I don't have a good answer for Kel again, but there might be something in that we saw this in the plagues when if it just happened like whenever, there's not like it might just be ascribed as like something natural and not miraculous. And in that, like it happens on a specific day, like it's very clear that God is doing it and not just like, oh, she happened, because they had lots of miscarriages, right? So that wouldn't have been surprising. The surprise is that like it comes out as predicted in a sense. There's also this weird thing with her name, right? Bathsheba literally means the daughter of seven, and I'm thinking there might be something there that's like some weird tie-in, but I have no idea.
That doesn't sound that weird to me. And I don't know. Shoot, I don't know either enough about womanly things or about David's question about the breast, but it's a transition point. I've lost a child far enough along that it was fairly horrendous. Not that they aren't, but I mean more horrendous than the ones I lost earlier. And I wonder if there isn't a little bit of kindness from God towards her in this 1 week.
Would this at all be connected to the period of like, because the story begins with her washing herself after a period of uncleanliness, right? And that would be, for those who don't know, you would be considered unclean for a week on this for 7. So when you enter a period of uncleanliness,
it depends on what type of uncleanliness, actually.
Right, I have the leprosy passage stuck in my head.
Right. So if she's a full zava, then it's a week. But if she's just menstruating, then it's not. Though nowadays we do wait a week, so it's a little different.
But so if it's the end of the week, if it's the day that she would be taking the washing of purity like she was when David took her the first time, which is how she got pregnant in the first place.
Could potentially, I could see something, especially with Yoav's theory there, that if they planned it and they counted 7 days, and I could also see something different. I like Sandy's suggestion of as an act of mercy, not with the bris, but with the other commandment around 8 days, which is do not take, you don't take a lamb from its mother until the 8th day, right? So especially with the whole lamb story, like you can't sacrifice it until it's at least 8 days old. That they have to have a week together as an act, which is this act of mercy and parental, like respect for parental bonding and connection. So there might be something there too, which is kind of fascinating.
Small point. First, when David is fasting, people who approach him are the elder of his house. And then when he rises up, the people approach him are the servants in the house. Who are the elders of David's house? And what is a house? Do they mean the elders of his family or some old people who happen to live in the house? and what is the reason for the difference. I think people were afraid, that people didn't know how he's going to react. So they sent the elders, like the story in Shogun, when somebody had to take away the dead pheasant that was hanging from the roof. So they chose the old gardener.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Go ahead.
Just picking up on what Yoav said about the elders, right? And what they're specifically sent to raise him from the earth. There's this very interesting. Before we had a lot of horizontal movement, sending messengers back and forth, but here we have this whole vertical thing where the sin starts on the roof, and now he's been sent to the earth, and he is stuck there, right? So if we have this vertical fall, very physical, right, and then he's going to get up from that when after the child dies. So there is. I don't know. Just thinking about these movements and positions, which are kind of interesting. And on top,
I know you said day of like rest is not death, but is not the eighth day like a resurrection motif? Like,
not really. I mean, I know Christianity wants that. It's more we think about it, especially like Hanukkah or something, but we see it also with bris and other things. It's more like you're an octave up. You move from one octave to the next octave. So you go up the seven notes and you're on the next octave. There's no death of the previous octave. You're still harmonizing with it. You're containing and resonating with the previous note, but you're at another level now. It's recreation, but it's not really resurrection.
I'm just, again, the passages where you become a new flesh, or okay, let me
pointing to Tanakh passages about the eighth day. That's right. They don't do that.
It specifically says the leper becomes a new flesh on the eighth day, and there's another passage where it speaks of someone after they're cleaned.
It says it doesn't say a new flesh. I would contest your translation.
Okay.
Well, isn't it interesting
right. That's excellent.
too that like when you think of, I don't know, maybe it's a very Christian thing. When you think of recreation in English here, which we use, and if you're in a religious context, you frame recreation in one particular way. But if we say the same word as a word, recreation, it has a completely opposite connotation to laying down in death, becoming immobile. It's that engagement, that play, that sense of that I hear in Yosef saying, well, you go up an octave. Well, that's when harmony happens. That's when things can start to bounce off each other. And, the whole sound becomes different. It's more, not less.
Yeah. Okay, this is a whole other conversation, which I would love to have, but can't have right now. But that's it's very good. It's very good. This idea of going up an octave. I'm liking a lot of it, and Yosef, I hope you always know that I enjoy the pushback. I want to understand what images God is using, and I think it's important. And so I very much appreciate it, because I think it's making. There's no benefit in just being allowed to do things without them being grounded. I want to be deeply grounded, so I appreciate it. Okay, I still have my perspective.
I will say,
because I still have other things I want to talk about.
Yeah, no, and I know I want to actually to strengthen one thing you said. You said there's this connection between how when she washed at the beginning from impurity, he does do that. Like forget the 7 days. We can talk about whether that's relevant, but he does wash and goes to the temple, which means he has to wash to purify himself to go to the temple, right? So he actually, it's very much more explicit, I'd say, that he is repeating that action. And maybe trying to redeem it, fix it, tikkun. We can talk about it, like what, why, but he does that, and then he goes first to the temple, right? It's not the temple, sorry, the temple's not built yet. He goes to the tabernacle, but it calls it the house of God in this sentence. And he goes to bow there. And then he comes home to his house. So it also plays with the whole chapter about God's house versus David's house, and kind of, does God need a house? And, that whole question is being sort of resonated here again, which also gets to maybe a question of why the chapters are ordered the way they're ordered. And, what should come first and how.
Okay, Sandy, would you continue reading for us? This is all very good. Thank you.
Okay, we were at 20, heading into 21. Then his servants said to him, "What is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food." He said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, 'Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live?' But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me."
That sentence right there, this is a conversation that I have with people when they tell me that there is no afterlife in Judaism. David believes he's going to where the child is, and that it's something worth somehow celebrating over. It seems very strange to me if he's going into like soul sleep, or he's just going out of existence. David says he's going to where the child is going. Anyway, and then there was this other bit that I was saying to you before, Yosef, where he says, "Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live." So there's an idea that that God may not fully punish him. Maybe just a taste of.
I was
Sandy?
thinking of Jonah, that whole, I don't want to go and tell them they have to repent or that you're going to kill them, because I know how many times, I know you, if I go and do that, then you're going to turn around and forgive them. Sorry.
No, it's good.
Baby died. I have to cry. Also,
Yeah.
I think about death a lot, because I love that last sentence. It's been almost 4 years since Jack died. And I tell people who tell me, "This is stupid that you're still crying." I said, do not think it's stupid. It's not even remotely stupid.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anywho, I
No,
think about
this right here is something exactly what you're saying, Sandy, is something that I sent to comfort someone that I knew that had a stillborn, that had a miscarriage. The idea, can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. This idea of like you'll go to them. You will go to
I
them.
pray that every day. I love that sentence in there. The people who go on ahead, that's the one thing I really want to be sure of is, yeah. There's a return, but it's not this direction.
Yeah.
It was David's opinion. That was David's belief. I do not know whether I believe him, because, as I said earlier today, he took his time to understand God. His picture of God was not correct at the beginning of his career. He learned on the job. He spent a lot of time with the Philistines. Could be that his view of afterlife was very much influenced by them.
It's possible you're wrong, but there's plenty of evidence from Breshit already that there was something like this, because the entire idea of Yasef el Avotav is this idea, right? We have this phrase. It goes back to Breshit. It's in Devarim, right? It's in multiple places. in Torah and before this book, at least depending on how you want to date books. Obviously, we can talk about academic, archaeological, whatever dating of books. But like, if we take the books at face value that they are in the correct order, and at some level, then I think it's already there. I don't think it's necessarily Philistine influence.
Well, I don't know better than David. Yes, that's
Right. I think the other problem is the Philistines didn't believe in an afterlife at this point. This is James Tabor's research on the development of the afterlife in Greek thought, that he doesn't think that they have a conception of afterlife where there are really souls like that you need to pray for that are in, you know, Tartarus or wherever until the 4th century. He has like a very long argument about this, and he thinks that it's a parallel development in Judaism at the same time as opposed to earlier, but we can talk about that. But it's hard to say the Philistines had this belief earlier if they really are the Greeks.
Okay. So you said that was not the original Greek position before the 4th century. This is interesting.
Yeah, I can send you something on that if you want some.
Thank you, but I think I'll manage. About the phrase to be gathered with his fathers, that could be read just technically, not theologically.
Well,
but
except
okay, I do not know better.
Right, I hear you. It's also it's said for Abraham, and he's not being buried with Terach or any of his fathers, or even in the same land. So it's hard to say it's technical when it's used for Abraham.
Okay, that is more convincing.
Good. Okay, would the baby being born out of wedlock have any negative consequences for the child afterwards? Would that be seen at that time? I don't know the answer.
That's a very complicated question. If he had lived, I assume. I mean, so it depends on what you think happened with the soldiers and whether Uriah had written. So that because in the oral tradition, there's this idea that the soldiers of David conditionally divorced their wives in case they got captured more, so their wives could remarry.
Yeah,
that is not in the text, obviously. So if you don't have the view of that oral tradition and just have the text, then the child is a mamzer, so like a legal bastard, and there would be ramifications for that child. They wouldn't be able to marry a number of different groups within the Israelites. They'd have to marry another mamzer or a freed slave who has converted to Judaism. Those are really the ramifications. It's basically, I mean, they're still a full member of society. It's just a limitation on who they're allowed to marry. They can't marry a priest. They can't marry a Levite. They can't marry a normal Israelite. They have to marry within this very specific class. If you believe in the oral tradition understanding with the conditional divorce, then it's a child not born out of wedlock, but just out of non-marital intimacy. And then they aren't technically well. It's a different status. It has other complications, but it's not quite as severe. In some ways, like they're basically a full legal child of David in that sense.
Sandy, you are having clearly a reaction to all of this, and I would like to hear it if you would like to share it.
No, I just always Judaism's complicated.
It is.
Yeah.
Very complicated.
Look, Cassandra, you're doing work. She's not here, but she's doing work. The text continues to call her Uriah's wife, except for one verse.
Right, and then it's going to switch from calling her that in the next verse, right, in the chapter. It's going to say she's David's wife in verse 24.
Comforted his wife.
Comforted his wife. Yeah. And it's very pointed. It's a very good point, Cassandra.
Yeah. And then Don is asking, is the marriage restriction limited to a certain number of generations? Or
this is one that's forever, and it's a huge. This is one of the huge issues that Jews even today deal with because it's a forever one.
Oh,
It's a very hot and controversial topic that we can talk about if you ever really want to get a controversial stream, not during Bible study.
I don't even know. Okay, look, I want to get
It comes up
through.
a lot even during Bible study. I have to confess, there are days I avoid jumping in.
Yeah. Sometimes the stories are a bit, yeah. Okay, Sandy, it sounds like you are emotional right now, which is entirely acceptable. Are you able to read, or would you like me to read? I am, in fact, literate and able to read.
No.
Boy. Okay. Then David comforted.
Sorry, Sandy, that was cultural appropriation. I just need to say that. Continue. The oi. Okay, sorry, continue.
I am woman. I am well gifted at reading between the teardrops. It's all good.
Oh my. Okay, go ahead.
Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went in to her and lay with her, and she bore a son. And he called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him and sent a message to Nathan the prophet. So he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord.
Because that name means loved by, like loved by Hashem, is what the name means.
Yeah, so it's also etymologically basically the same as the word David.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's another section related to that. So the other bit of it, this does get to me. Then David comforted his wife, Bathsheba. The image of comforting. It's somehow this tragedy has like sweetness at the end. This is such a good text. Go ahead.
But it's also like he was in his own grief for the past week,
yeah,
and like not with her, and maybe she was in her. I mean, I think like part of the woman's side of the story here is really not told, but presumably she also has been grieving for a week, but we don't know what's happening with her. But they're kind of in their isolation, and now they're coming together. It's a very interesting phrase because this pasuk, this verse is very, very similar to the verse when Isaac marries Rebecca and is comforted after the loss of his mother. And it's also reminiscent of like this phrase about being loved. This love also is when the brother, and I think it's Judah, is describing the loss of Joseph and the pain that caused to Joseph, who he doesn't know is his brother yet. Right. Mm-hmm. In that scene, he uses this phrase too, like that he loved. So there's some weird, interesting parallels going on here with the death of sons and being comforted, and wives, and the power of couples to comfort each other, that are just weaving everything together.
And sorry, I just think this would add very nicely for you, Sandy, is that the word David, that root also comes from the Hebrew word for nipple. And why that has a notion of belovedness is it's an image of a mother nurturing a child, right? That it's specifically that relationship that's how that is conveying love. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Sandy.
I was just gonna ask whether the word in Hebrew where we have comforted also carries that sense of bringing strength to each other in some respect or other.
Not particularly. This is a very interesting and complicated word because it's also so it's the word. It's much more related to the word for bringing rest than strength. It's comfort, kind of bringing like Noah. Like he was named because he was going to bring rest from the curse, and to kind of be like set down. But at the same time, this word is super important from the Saul stories because it's also the word for regret and to change one's mind. So we had that whole argument, I think, in 1 Samuel 15, that's where they say God doesn't change his mind. Sorry, God regrets making Saul king, but he doesn't change his mind. But but then he does change his mind by taking the kingship away from Saul. And throughout that whole story, they use this word over and over again. So it's a really hard to pin down word in Hebrew because it has, even biblically, so many meanings that are also supercharged in the book of Samuel, right? But so in the sense of changing one's mind, right? So it's to bring rest, but it does that through this. It's a very kind of, I would say cognitive, but it's like cognitive emotional, really, right? Like it's CBT, right? He does, yeah. Anyway, I don't know if I was at all helpful, Sandy, but it has all these connotations that we have to kind of deal with.
I like that word. It has an entire story in it.
It does.
Yeah. Just beautiful. But then it's causing more and more problems for me to not to connect rest with the seventh day and the seventh day with Dad.
It's the opposite for me. It makes total sense.
Yeah, I know. I see how that could make it harder for you, David, and easier for Sandy. I'll also say there's something really interesting here.
No. I mean to not talk about it.
I was not talking about it, right? No, it's clearly
that does have more connections.
Yeah. I hear you. I also say that we had it before, David being disengaged from the world, right? He was like sitting on his roof, looking down everything. He had all these messengers going back and forth. He wasn't in the battle, and now, like in this, he's now transformed into super highly engaged, right? So he's now being described very actively. He's not sitting in his house anymore. He's like, he fasts. He's doing all these things. Like no one's doing it for him. He's doing it himself. And then he has to go to the temple himself, goes to his house, he eats, and then he goes to her, right? He doesn't have her come to him. There's no messengers anymore. Everything is direct action, and he's the one taking it now. Where he's what do you want to call it? Like he's embodying his life, re-embedding in it, like becoming the active, writer of his own story, however you want, whatever it's verb you want to put in here, but like in descriptions, where he's like re-engaging with the world, and he does that specifically, and it seems to be at the crux is as a husband, and this gets into what you're talking about with the meaning of the root of David and Yedidia and belovedness and nurturingness, right? Like, and comfort and rest, right? That he's able to do that not by disengaging, but by re-engaging.
Right. Okay, I need to finish this chapter. I need to get through it, and I only have one thing that I notice in this last section. So we'll get through it. I'll say my one thing. I'll let you guys say your one thing, and then I will tell Yosef what section I want to talk to him about later. Sandy, go ahead. Finish off the chapter for us.
Naob fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and took the royal city. And Joab sent messengers to David and said, I have fought against Rabbah. Moreover, I have taken the city of waters. And then now gather the rest of the people together and encamp against the city and take it, lest I take the city and it be called by my name. So David gathered all the people together and went to Rabbah and fought against it and took it. And he took the crown of their king from his head. The weight of it was a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone. And it was placed on David's head, and he brought out the spoil of the city, a very great amount. And he brought out the people who were in it, and set them to labor with saws and iron picks and iron axes, and made them toil at the brick kilns. And thus he did to all the cities of the Ammonites. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem.
So this is the only thing that I noticed. The making of bricks, which to me is connecting it with Babel and with Egypt. And that David is wearing the crown of the Ammonites. So there's a victory in here where it seems like God hasn't abandoned him because he's still being blessed and things are happening. But there's a bit of an image, to me at least, that there's as like in part of David's fall from grace. How do you make a king look like he falls from grace? You make him look like Pharaoh or the head of Babel. Yeah, that's my one observation in this area. Anyone else? Nothing. Okay, guys, this was a great week. This was a wonderful week. I appreciate it. Joseph, may you be so inattentive on all weeks. Go ahead, Yoav.
Let's say that we have finished our discussion on this chapter.
Yeah.
And we have the rule of engagement is that we don't dispute the written word. So off the record, after finished our discussion,
that's good. That's good. Go ahead.
I would make just personal statements. First, I do not believe that that David was his real name. I think it's a nickname, a bit like North Korea. Like you have the dear leader and the beloved leader. That's not the real name, but this is how they call it. The father is called the dear leader and the son is called the beloved leader. Same with David.
So he's the king who's David. Yeah. Yeah.
So it hints like a bit of a regime that starts to feel like North Korea. And that's not a compliment. Second personal statement. In a different parallel universe, not in this story, the baby did not die. It was just smuggled away, hidden away. And was put in public again a year after. So it's the same baby. The first and the second are the same baby. Only he got two names because he appeared twice in the story. And that solves a problem because now David is married and the boy is not a mamzer. And he can be the king and he can marry around. But that's a parallel universe. That's not in our chapter.
Yoav, that was delicious. That was delicious. I don't agree with it. Obviously, you did what was right. You said, now that we're done the text, let's just play with it. But man, that was delicious. Now, later today, you should repent of this opinion. But thank you for sharing it. Okay, guys, I gotta get going. Thank you so much for this time. Joseph, part of what I want to talk to you about in the future is if the 8th day is not connected to resurrection. This is this is part of the bigger conversation, but you can see where my thinking is the feast we celebrate. And I say we because the Gentiles will celebrate with you as well. The feast that is celebrated once the resurrection occurs is the Feast of Tabernacles, which before there is Hanukkah has the great day, the 8th day.
Well, the 8th day is not celebrated by Gentiles, though. That's the one day that's reserved and only celebrated by Israel. The 70 nations only get the 7 days. Very, this is a very tricky area to exegete, right? So we're gonna have to have a whole discussion.
But the feast with 8 days is connected to the resurrection.
No.
Okay, sorry.
It's actually funny because the 7-day tabernacles is part of the Messianic era. This is super complicated because there's also a concept that all the feast days essentially will get nullified except for Purim in the Messianic era. That's a whole other discussion to have. But the eighth day is not. The eighth day is its own feast. It's a separate thing. There's no feast of 8 days. The eighth day is a separate feast called the Feast of the Eighth Day. It's not the 7-day tabernacles, which is the part that the Gentiles try to participate in and sort of fail, or maybe succeed or partially fail in Zechariah.
What? Oh, this is a much longer conversation. Thank you all.
Yes, it is.
Thank you,
I would love
everyone.
to hear that conversation between you guys, because I know. Well, I would love to hear that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
If David didn't have to go.
I'll see you all next week. Thank you so much for attending. This was a wonderful week. Sandy, thank you for coming. Your tears are appreciated and are remembered. Thank you. Thank you.
Gift. I've
Thanks,
cried
everyone.
more places that people have thanked me for tears. I'll cry anywhere.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, I'll talk to you guys later. Goodbye. Thank you.